Welcome into our first installment of the Road to 2000. So I recently played a tournament on Saturday, and I'm going to be just quickly going through some of the games. I have my first game is against a young boy named Krishna. He was 9 years old. I have the black pieces. And before the game, I went to go look at some of his stats. He's about 1,000 rated, but children are historically underrated, and they're very, very scary because they don't play super often and they get a lot better very, very quickly. They're usually very sharp. So that means good in complicated situations, but they're less good in positional battles. So my goal this game was to keep things solid, not make big mistakes, try and stay out of tactics with Krishna. So Krishna opens with e4, and I respond with c6, the Karo Khan. This is my go-to defense against e4. It's supposedly very strong and solid. He plays d5 or d4, d5, and then goes to knight c3. With knight c3, there are a couple traditional ways to play. The uber normal way to play is taking and playing sort of this position where you have a knight out, or you have a bishop out and they have a knight out, and they have a little bit more central space. I don't like this position very much because that knight on g3 stops all of your attacks against the king side if you ever want to get aggressive. So the way I tend to play this is with a6, which takes us out of theory, but it keeps the tension in the center and allows for transpositions, which means we can go into other kinds of Karo Khans. If my opponent takes or pushes, then we go back into where we know. And if they choose to develop normally, like they do in the game, then I can still play my game. And this way I have more typical attacking chances rather than the kind of draw fest from the classical. So here my opponent chooses to take and bring us into an exchange. This opens up my C file for the future and sort of bolsters my center. But it also gives him open lines against my king down the middle if he can get his bishop out and get castled. So after takes, he plays h3, and traditional wisdom says that bishops are better than knights, but I already have these nice 5 pawns on light squares, and with plans to get a 6th, connect my chains. And so when you have so many pawns on light squares, your light squared bishop is less powerful because it's blocked by these visions. So I use the positional idea to take that knight for the light square bishop and build up on the light squares. Now, after this, my opponent plays bishop d2, when typically people are developing their light square bishops and kingside castling. This opponent has chosen to bring his dark square bishop first showing that he's likely going to queenside castle. And I can't queenside castle with him because it's open space. So this is going to turn into a aggressive fighting game if we decide to castle on opposite sides. But I decide to let him bring it on. This move, bishop d2, just prepares castling. It doesn't address his center, so I will develop my knight attacking his pawn. And he will defend his pawn, lining up his queen with my king, and threaten to take my pawn. Now, to address this threat, there are a couple different ways. We can break the pin, or we can defend the pawn. Now, I wanted to develop and also address the situation. So I chose knight to f3, developing the knight and protecting the pawn. I rejected knight ge7 because it blocked in my dark squared bishop that is eventually going to be attacking his king. It turns out the computer likes this move a lot better, and we'll see why very shortly. This knight actually ends up being more of a target than an asset. But we'll move on. The opponent decides to queenside castle, and this is where I take my first big think of the game. I only know a few things about opposite side castling. I know that typically we like to pawn storm because our king isn't behind our pawns and their king is. So if we can break through with our pawns, then our pieces come crashing through. I also know that I have an open sight line with my rook against his king, and I know that I want to get as many points of material into the attack as I can. So my two moves that I'm considering are queen b6 to get my queen into the attack, and that puts pressure here so that if he ever plays king b1, which is a very common move in queenside castling, our bishop and queen will team up on this b2 square. And my other move is rook c8, lining up the rook with the king. I ultimately reject queen b6 because I liked the idea of a pawn storm in the future, and having the queen on b6 blocks our ability to pawn storm. So after about 15 minutes of thought, I play rook c8. Now it ends up queen b6 is the slightly better move, but this move works just fine. And after rook c8, my opponent begins to launch his attack. He plays g4. Now, g4 is a very aggressive move. It's going to dislodge my knight that is playing a key defensive role on this square. And the whole idea is he's going to play g5 and then take this pawn. Not immediately with the queen, but he's beginning his attack. My initial response was prophylactically moving this knight or preventing the push. Now, if I choose to prevent the push, he can go to h4 and then reestablish the push. And I didn't like walking directly into his pawn storm. So my next thought was to retreat the knight, but this runs into knight takes. And I can't quite go forward because I will lose a pawn, and then he will come crashing through with d5. So now I have to find something a little more creative. I end up calculating b5 with the idea of g5, b4, takes, and if he continues to take, I will check and then be up a piece. Now that's where I ended my calculation, and I figured that if he doesn't go all the way, if takes, we're still even on material, and this should be fine. However, what I looked over was that in this position, I am opening the sight line for this bishop onto my undefended pawn. Now, seeing this from a distance, I didn't think it was a big deal. I thought that if this bishop ever ends up here, this rook will attack, and I have wide open sight lines against this naked king. But it ends up that in this position, he plays g5, forced to play b4, and after takes, this move comes with some venom, because if I play the plan that I had from a distance, he will pin my knight and win my knight in spectacular fashion. So this would cause me to go back, and now this is disgustingly passive. The whole my attack is completely neutralized, and I'm down a pawn. So after takes, my rook is under attack, so I figure I have to move it. And so since I can't move it here, the only other logical square is here to be lining up down this file, preventing him from pinning me. Now here I got some nasty thoughts about a couple fancy moves, one of which I ended up played bishop to d6, completely giving up my rook for free, can capture it, no questions asked, but his queen will get pinned and winned. So in order to sidestep the pin, he goes to b1, and now my rook can follow his king and set up some nasty things. Now, after this move, it was my opponent's first time for his long think. There are no more big tactics, and the game has become a more positional battle as the dust is beginning to settle. The moves I was prepared for were a4 to try and reestablish this pin, but I figured that my opponent would throw this out because we're pushing pawns in front of the king, especially with open sight lines. Things can get nasty very quickly. The other few moves were continuing a pawn storm or bringing rooks to the open file. My opponent thought for about 20 minutes before playing rook g1. This is trying to prevent me from castling because he is launching an attack on where my king would be. Now, here I was trying to call his bluff, and I chose to castle into the attack regardless. I figured that if I can get my king into safety in the corner, then I can start really launching some attacks with these rooks and get some help with the queen if I can destabilize this center. Now, here being a pawn up, he is deciding to trade queens, and I have the option to trade on his terms or defend my queen and I liked the decision to trade on my terms, give some pressure onto this center pawn. I know that I'm losing in this position, but I think the only way out is counterplay on this center and eventually onto the king. Now here, my opponent is noticing some of the pressure on the center, and they're getting nervous trying to bring their bishops into the game, and they decide to play rook g4, reinforcing the center. I did not like this move from my opponent. I think that there were other ways to navigate the position. The computer thinks it's okay, but it's obvious that they're trying to double up and launch their attack that way. Here I play a move rook b6, kicking out this bishop, and then rook to c8, lining up an attack on this bishop that is not defended because of the pin. My opponent plays rook to g1, doubling up, and this is where I gain my confidence back a little bit, and I see a concrete plan. I can rotate my knight with tempo on the bishop so that I'm attacking this pawn from this side while defending, and I can stockpile pressure, hopefully taking down this pawn and getting rid of his advantage. So after playing knight to e7, my opponent decides to attack my rook, and I go back. He's still left with all the same problems that he had. I'm still going to go here, stockpile pressure, and try and take this pawn. So he moves all the way back. I assume that his intention is to play here and guard things like that, but then this bishop is now like a big pawn. He's stuck between two other pawns, not great vision. Hopefully I'll be able to find a way to hold. So after rook f5, my opponent surprises me and plays bishop to f4. Now, here I begin to panic for a while because this is a direct attack on my rook, and this pawn is completely hanging. But if I move my rook anywhere, he can protect this pawn from the other side and threaten to take my bishop due to the pin. So I'll be forced to capture. And now he's a clean pawn up with his attack rolling in, and my rooks are uncoordinated, and there's really no hope in this position. I might as well resign here. So I can't really move my rook, or else it's hopeless. So I have to decide to give up the exchange. Now, the question is, am I going to capture this pawn with a bishop or a knight? I choose the knight in order to attack this bishop and eventually attack this rook, making some complications now that I'm definitely losing. The computer prefers bishop takes, but it seems much more complicated, and I really didn't quite understand. In this position, my opponent doesn't take any time, and they capture my rook. It's actually much better if they get this bishop out of danger first and then attack my, probably here. But yeah, much better for them to get out of danger first rather than being hasty and taking this rook, allowing me to take a bishop on the way out. And now, since this rook is being attacked, captures. And now that the dust has settled, I have a huge attack looming on his king. He can't go to the corner because I will win everything. So he's forced to go to the center, and I'm cleaning up his pawns. Now here I'm pretty confident. I know it's either going to be a draw or a win for me since I have the pawn advantage. We're getting low on time, but I think that there's absolutely no way I can lose this game. Gives me a check, attacks a pawn, and I play a fancy move, play bishop to c3, that way if takes mate, so he can't take, and he tries to dislodge my bishop, and here I missed the one big tactic of the game that I wish I had found. It takes forced distraction, so that if king takes, rook takes, and if he tries to get this rook, I can take, and just be 2 pawns up. But instead, here I am moving quickly and I play pawn to d4, stabilizing this bishop so it never leaves. He moves, recreating some threats, and now that my pawns are on dark squares, I decide to force this trade and start building up with my plans to push my pawns, run my king, and promote. Here he's moving around trying to get his king into the game. It feels kind of hopeless here for him. Now here I was scared of a sack and trying to push this pawn, so I end up playing pawn to e5, still thinking about this sack, and he plays h4, and to avoid the sack I move bishop to e1, threatening this pawn and the rook through it. He moves back, and then under some time pressure he is getting antsy and eventually blunders. Now, blunder doesn't seem too big of a deal, but he is obviously not having a great time and ends up going for a Hail Mary here, where he just takes and tries to push through, but too fast, and from this position it's trivial. And I ended up mating him with about 2 minutes left on the clock, and he had about 30 seconds. But that was our first game. Went very, very well. Took about an hour 30, and yeah, I was very, very happy with this game. Very, very happy with this game. It was a good comeback, good find. I am interested about this position a little bit, that the computer evaluates as equal. It's the same idea where I have pawns and a bishop and a knight, but it thinks that this is significantly better than taking with the knight. I don't know. I will look into that later, but yeah, that was my first round. Went very, very well.